Welcome. My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and I'd like to welcome all of our participants on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada. Jose and Father Scott Lewis and Albert, our translator, are very happy you could all join us. We have 695 registered participants and numerous countries, Australia, the Philippines, across Canada, the United States. So we're really excited about this new initiative. On behalf of Jose, who's been just wonderful, taking care of all the tech and answering a lot of your emails, and Scott and myself, we'd like to tell you how happy we are you're all here. This session will be recorded and will be on the Jesuit website tomorrow. It will only be in English, even though we have direct translation of this seminar in French. When next week's seminar will be in French and translated into English, it will be recorded only in French. So I'd like to start, first of all, by giving an acknowledgement to the lands that we are on, which is Indigenous land. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the Jesuit Sacred Heart House operates. For thousands of years, it has been the transitional land of Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Before we get started, I'll just mention a couple of housekeeping things. If you have a question that we will ask our speaker at after 45 minutes, you can put that question in the Q&A button, which would either be at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what version that you have. If you want to listen to Scott's session in French, you click the French button, and I'll ask Jose to speak to that shortly. So I'm going to turn it over to Jose to just talk about some of the technical issues some of you may have. And when it comes time to question and answer, we will ask those questions of Scott. Thank you. Jose?
Yeah, just like Pat said, if any of you wish to listen to this session in French or English, you can choose a language of your choice through the translation button or the interpretation button. Remember that a recording of the session will be sent to all of you at the end of the session tomorrow, actually 24 hours after the session ends. And we will also be posting the link in the chat box so that you can know where to find it tomorrow. And the last thing is that if you have any support related questions, you can contact me personally through the chat box, and I will do my best to assist you. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Jose. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Father Scott Lewis. He is a member of the Society of Jesus, and he's an associate professor of New Testament at Regis College. He is the author of the weekly column in the Catholic Register, God's Word on Sunday, and his previous books include the Getting to Know Scripture series from Novalis and the Gospel According to John Liturgical Press. And I'll just hold up here a copy of his latest book, How Not to Read the Bible, which is available on Amazon. So it's over to you, Scott. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Pat. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to begin our journey this evening by relating a story that is probably apocryphal, but very revealing just the same. As the story goes, a few years ago, several Jesuit vocation directors got together for a meeting. And one of them said, I have a man who has applied to the society, and I want to give you his background and then get your advice as to whether we should admit him or not. And so he read the description of this man. He's already approaching middle age. He's poorly educated. He's arrogant. He's proud. He has a hot temper. He's been in trouble many times. He has a police record. There's even rumors that he has fathered children. And not only that, now he has a physical handicap and walks with a great deal of difficulty. And so when all that was finished, he said, should we admit him? And they said, oh, no. They were horrified. And then he said, well, you've just refused Saint Ignatius, our founder. And the story it is revealing in that it tells the story of Ignatius in a nutshell. The story of Ignatius is the story of a journey of a soul, the formation of a very flawed man into a saint through life experiences and God's grace. Often events intervene in our lives that set us on a completely different direction and calling than the one that we had been pursuing. And his experiences became the catalyst for his spirituality and the spiritual exercises. He was born in 1491 in Basque country, Gipuzkoa, to a noble Basque family, and he was the youngest of 13 children. The place where he was born was Asceticism, in a place called Loyola, and his name was originally Inigo. And Inigo, of course, he was named after a local saint, and later on he changed it to Ignatius after Ignatius of Antioch. He grew up as a page in the household of the royal treasurer of Castile, Juan Velázquez de Cuellar. He's been described, and here I will share with you some pictures that we have here that will illustrate his life. And he's been described as he's been described in many ways. He's been described as a youthful courtier, a swaggering caballero, and a soldier in the service of the Spanish king. Another writer calls him a fancy dresser, an expert dancer, a womanizer, sensitive to insult, and a rough, punkish swordsman who used his privileged status to escape prosecution for violent crimes committed with his priest brother at carnival time. Both of these then relate his life, shall we say, BC, before conversion. And the story itself is going to be quite an adventure. And right here, we start off with the well-known picture of Ignatius the saint, and then Ignatius the official saint. And here he is in the ceiling of the Church of San Ignazio in Rome as he's ascending to heaven. But there's a long way before we get there. And this is the place where he was born, the sanctuary of Saint Ignatius in Aspecia in Basque country. Here he is as the young caballero. And as you can see, he's quite pleased with himself. A little bit of a swagger right there. He served in the military for the Duke of Najera, the Viceroy of Navarre. And there was a war going on between France and the Holy Roman Emperor, Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And Ignatius was serving as an officer in this army. And after he was in several battles and managed to escape unscathed. And in one battle, Ignatius and his troops were surrounded at the town of Pamplona. And most of them wanted to surrender. They wanted to surrender, but he wouldn't hear of it. He was filled with fire, and he urged them to fight on. And it's at this point that the autobiography which we are looking at begins. And the autobiography was dictated to his secretary near the end of his life, from the years 1553 to 1555. It's at this point that a cannonball shattered his leg and his career. As you can see in this particular picture, it hit a wall and ricocheted off of his leg, pretty much pulverizing above the knee. And since he was a nobleman, the French gallantly took him back to his home for convalescence. There's the place where he fell. If you go to Pamplona today, the walls are gone, but as there is, you can see the outline of the walls as you walk along, and here is this brass plaque here. And this is the place where Ignatius fell on the 20th of May, 1521. I asked the guide we were with, how do we know this is the place where Ignatius was wounded? And he said, well, that's easy. There's a brass plaque here. That's an example of a circular argument. And so during this convalescence, he had several operations because the leg set improperly. He had to have the leg rebroken and reset. Of course, this is before the days of anesthesia. And according to his autobiography, he bore it all very stoically. It didn't grow back right, though, and it grew out crooked, sticking out of his stocking. And being a rather vain man and not wanting something unsightly on him, he asked that the flesh and the bone be cut away, which he again bore very stoically. The result of this was one leg was shorter than the other, and for the rest of his life, he walked with a limp. And this is no small thing because he walked for literally hundreds of miles during his career as a pilgrim. And to do that and not to have full use of his legs must have been excruciating. Well, during his convalescence, and here we see him convalescing in his room, he was bored and he wanted something to read. He wanted fluff. He wanted entertainment reading. And he was through and through romantic. He had a very active imagination. He liked to fantasize about accomplishing great deeds, serving kings and doing deeds out of devotion to an unattainable great lady. And this chivalrous mentality revealed that in many ways, Ignatius was a man of the late Middle Ages. They didn't have any, or at least claim they didn't have any of those books. And all they had were The Life of Christ by Ludolf of Saxony and The Golden Legend, which is a collection of lives of the saints by Jacopo da Voragine. This was standard fare in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, and it was pious stuff, but it was filled with probably an insight into the late medieval mind. And so he resigned himself to reading these books. And as he read the books, they were very important books because they laid the groundwork for his recognition of something very important for his spirituality. And that's the two spirits and their characteristics of consolation and desolation. And he noticed that when he fantasized about doing great deeds for kings and ladies, they were exciting, they were thrilling. But afterwards, it left him kind of empty and restless. But when he read the lives of the saints, he began to fantasize in another direction. He thought about doing great deeds of renunciation and holiness, like the saints, like Saint Dominic and Saint Francis. He said, why can't I do that? And when he did this, he was left with a feeling of contentment and peace and consolation. And he began to dawn on him that there were two spirits at work in him. One was what he would later call the evil spirit, which led him away from God. And the other, the good spirit, would lead him towards God. And by listening and feeling, paying attention to those inner movements, those inner feelings, this is the groundwork for the practice of discernment. Finally, at the end of his convalescence, he made a decision. He chose to do great deeds out of love for God, and just like the saints. And he made the resolution to go to Jerusalem as a pilgrim and a penitent. His family wasn't too thrilled, but a vision of the Virgin Mary confirmed him in his decision. And at this point in his life, he was convinced that he was being instructed by God. And his eyes were open, but he was still at the beginning of his journey. So over the objections of his family and the Duke, he started for Montserrat. Montserrat in Spain, near Barcelona, is a huge mountain range, and we'll see that just a little bit later. and where there's a Benedictine monastery with a very famous statue of the Black Madonna. As he was on his way, he relates an incident, and it's a strange incident. He rode alongside a Moor, a Muslim, for a while, and as they rode along, they discussed various things, and then got into a discussion about the Virgin Mary. And the Moor said he believed in the virgin birth of Jesus, but he believed that afterwards Mary lived a normal married life. And after the Moor left and took a certain road towards the village, Ignatius thought about it, and he worked himself into quite a rage. And he believed that the Moor had dissed the mother of Jesus, and he made up his mind that he wanted to kill him. This is the old Ignatius that is still at work in him. But then he stopped, and he said, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And so he decided to give the reins to the donkey that he was on. If the donkey took the road to the left that went into the village, and it was very short, it was very close, he would enter the village and kill the Moor. If the donkey stayed on the road, well, then he would let the Moor go. Fortunately for the Moor, the donkey stayed on the road. And as twisted as this particular mode of discernment seems, it's still in its rudimentary stages. He was reluctant to act on his immediate impulses. And so this is the beginning of him thinking beyond his own impulses and desires and thinking about a power greater than himself, outside of himself. He finally made it to Montserrat, and he made a general confession. And he said, and these are his own words, that the general confession took 3 days to complete. And the priest, who was his confessor, introduced him to a manual of spiritual exercises by Garcia Jimenez de Cisneros. And this was something from the late Middle Ages. In that particular monastery, there were many that were written in the late Middle Ages, and it formed the basis of the spiritual exercises later. It was so he was introduced to it at a very early stage, and as he continued on his journey and on his pilgrimage, he would modify it and add various insights to it. At Montserrat, he gave over his sword to the Black Madonna, put it on the altar, and he had an all-night vigil there. He exchanged his clothes with a beggar, and this is the sword here today, which is now in Barcelona. And this is the monastery at Montserrat. And as you can see, it's very high up, and there are, when the clouds roll in, you can't see anything. And so as he gave over his sword and his dagger and moved on to his new life, he exchanged clothes with the beggar and began his journey. And as he was going down the road, some officers of the law caught up with him and asked him if he had given these clothes to a certain beggar. And Ignatius was very moved and was in tears because he realized what had happened. The police had seen the beggar wearing these fancy clothes and had accused him of stealing it. And so he continued on to Manresa. He planned to stay a short time, but it wound up to be almost a year. And some of the time he spent was in a cave. And this is the cave today. Of course, these things weren't in there when Ignatius was there. It was a very crude and rough cave, but now they have a chapel there. And that particular cave there's a church over it today. And in this particular cave, he fasted, he practiced very intense asceticism. He refused food and drink most of the time. He was kept alive, fed by pious women who used to bring him something to eat. And at this particular stage, his mental health began to break down. He was filthy. He said he let his hair grow very long, and he adds this little parenthetical comment, and he always refers to himself in the third person. He had a fine head of hair, and he let his fingernails grow very long. And he really approached mental breakdown. He was filled with self-loathing as he began to reflect on his sinful life, and he was assailed by scruples. He would go to confession again and again and again, and then he would think of something that he hadn't confessed or haven't confessed properly, and it began to drive him to the edge. And by his own pen, he admits that he had considered suicide. And finally, confessors ordered him not to confess the sins again. It didn't really work, and he finally succeeded because he recognized the source. These scruples and things were coming from the evil spirit, and he managed then to turn away from it and not listen to it. And after this period of intense asceticism and mental breakdown and so forth, he achieved what we would call more of a balanced or the median way of living. He took care of himself. He began to regain his health. And during this time, he had a vision of and he said it was like a serpent, and it had many eyes, and it was beautiful. And it gave him great consolation. And so he would see this particular vision many times. And during this particular period, many came to him for consolation and advice. And he was quite pleased. He said he could see the fruit of the Spirit in this and was much consoled. During this period also, he had many visions of Christ and many visions of Mary. Ignatius was a mystical man. He was a man of visions. They were everyday occurrences for him. And the visions were usually accompanied by great consolation and many times by great tears. He had one particular vision, which is very well known. He had a vision of the Trinity. Well, how do you depict the Trinity? It was like three keys of an organ that were playing in harmony. And this vision gave him great consolation. He said he was racked with sobs, and he had a great devotion to the Trinity throughout his life, sometimes praying to one person or the other of the Trinity, sometimes to the Trinity as a whole. He looked upon this period as himself as a student with God as the schoolmaster. He was beginning to learn when he still had a long way to go. This is the river Cardonniere that runs by Manresa. The church is on the right. And one day when he was sitting by the river Cardonniere, he had a revelation and a vision. And many mystics throughout the ages have had revelations near rivers and bodies of flowing water. And even in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel did while he was in Babylon. These are his own words. The eyes of understanding were opened, and he understood and knew many spiritual things and matters of faith learning. So great an enlightenment that everything seemed new to him. This was such that in the whole course of his life, through 62 years, even if he gathered up all the many helps he had had from God and all the things he knew and added them together, he does not think they would amount to as much as he had received at that one time. This was infused knowledge. It would get him in trouble later because he knew a lot of theology. And when he was questioned by the Inquisition, as he will be many times, he would give correct answers, but he had no basis for it. He had no education. He could not quote any books or authors. And so this was, it was a great blessing, but it had an edge to it too. The serpent vision, which had given him such consolation, at this point, he realized that the origin of it was demonic, and he dismissed it out of his life. And it was only after this revelation next to the Cardonniere River that he came to that realization. He had the first of many illnesses. He was close to death many times. He always managed to recover, although many times he had written himself off for dead. And at this point, he travels to Venice because he wants to depart for Jerusalem. He sleeps in fields and doorways. He begs for the fare to Jerusalem, but then, ironically, once he gets the money, he again has second thoughts and gives the money away to beggars. And even after he finally got on the ship, he realized he still had a few coins in his pocket, and he left those behind too and went without a cent in his pocket. He did this because he felt that he had to rely completely on God, and to take a lot of money with him would be showing a lack of faith. He had been introduced through contacts to the Doge of Venice, who had given him passage on a diplomatic ship headed for the Holy Land. And so off they went. And it's rather humorous, on this particular voyage, Ignatius, keeping in mind what kind of a person he had been, is absolutely horrified because the sailors on board are swearing and using blasphemies. And he began to rail at them and to preach at them. And the other passengers begged him to shut up. They said they had overheard the crew planning to abandon him on an island. So at this point, he had learned that there's a time and a place for everything, and sometimes it is better to say nothing. In 1523, he arrived in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was held by the Turks. They were conducted to the holy sites by Franciscan guides, and this was very influential later on, as he begins to, in the spiritual exercises, tell people to compose the scene in their mind, and to try to picture how things were right down to the infinite details, and then to place themselves in the scene. And so he visits all of these places, and he decides he wants to stay for the rest of his life. The Franciscan custos, the man in charge of the holy sites, ordered him to leave. And Ignatius did not want to leave, but the custos said, "I have the power to excommunicate you." And he showed him the bull of excommunication that he had. And so he had to leave. But he snuck away. He went back one more time to the Mount of Olives to see the footprint of Jesus, which is supposedly on the rock where Jesus kind of pushed off when he ascended to heaven. And he wanted to see which way it was pointed when he did so. Was it pointed towards Moab? Was it pointed towards the city? And so he bribed a guard with his pocket knife to let him have one more look. There was an arduous journey back to Spain, at sea for almost a month, nearly shipwrecked, cold and miserable. When he landed in Italy, he passed between two armies, the Spanish and the French, who were at war. And he was taken in for questioning and accused of being a spy by both sides. He was later released as a madman. It's at this point that he decided to begin his education. And at middle age, he had to go back to school. And he had to study Latin, 1524 in Barcelona, and then on to Salamanca in 1526, and finally to Alcalá in 1527. In Barcelona, there was a great conflict in his studies, because while he was studying, while he was listening to lectures, he would have great visions and consolations and revelations. And they were interfering with his comprehension of the material that he was to be mastering and memorizing. And it was a great effort for him to focus on the studies and push the other into the background. There's a time and place for everything, even for mystical visions. Even when studying, he continued to give the spiritual exercises to others. And one of the obsessions that he had is that everything that he did had to be, as he put it so many times, for the good of souls. But all was not well, because at Salamanca and Alcalá, he fell under suspicion by the Inquisition. He was suspected of being an alumbrado. The alumbrados, they were the illuminated ones, were groups of lay groups who met in homes, and they had different techniques for having mystical visions, and they kind of lived on the fringes of the church. And this is the period of great intolerance right after the reconquest of Spain, and the Inquisition was operating at full capacity, and it was not a time to fall under suspicion for anything. And so he was the victim of rumors. Many rumors had started about him. He was investigated, and then he was cleared. But he was ordered to dye his clothes black. He had been wearing brown clothes like a friar, like a mendicant. and to wear shoes. And he said they were told that you're not religious, so you cannot dress like religious. There was further trouble, his association with women whom he directed. Some of them were influenced by what he said and embarked on pilgrimages of their own. And these were women of high station. And so there was a lot of controversy over that. And so he spent up to 42 days in jail. And he refused offers to pull strings or buy him out. He said, again, that would be not trusting in God. When they were released, they were ordered to dress as students and not to speak of matters of faith until they had studied 4 more years, for they were unlearned. Here Ignatius gets a little dig in, and he said, this is the inquisitor who's telling him that. And Ignatius says, in truth, the pilgrim was the one who knew the most, though his learning had little foundation. So he consoled himself with the fact that he knew far more than the inquisitor who was giving him so much trouble. This was upsetting for him because he felt like he was, doors were being closed to him. So he proceeded to Salamanca. And again, he was given the 3rd degree by the Dominicans and imprisoned again. And after examination, he was released, but forbidden to talk about the difference between venial and mortal sins. He was outraged, but he felt his mouth had been shut and that he could no longer help souls. But at this point, he saw the writing on the wall. He decided to study theology, so off he went to the University of Paris. He went alone and on foot. This was a period of great intellectual and spiritual ferment. It was the Reformation was just starting. Humanism was in the air. There were countries were at war. He walked into the center of a maelstrom there in Paris, and he stayed at the College of Montaigu. It's a very austere college. And while he was there, he engaged in spiritual conversation and the giving of the exercises, and this was his main ministry. And he influenced some important students to leave everything and go begging. One entered a monastery, another went to Jerusalem. So great murmuring started against him again as a troublemaker. And once again, he was accused of the Inquisition. Always short of funds, he begged on the street. He went to Flanders and even to England to beg for the means to continue his studies. He wasn't the greatest of students. He was deficient, so he was put in with the young boys at first to catch up. And the problem of spiritual inspirations and consolations during lectures returned, as did the poor health and the chronic stomach pains. Later, he transferred to Santa Barbara. The many Spanish and Portuguese students were there. And this is where he met most of the first companions that became Jesuits with him. Great spiritual comradeship. Francis Xavier, Alfonso Salmeron, Diego Lainez, Nicolas Bobadilla. They were Spanish. Peter Faber was from Savoy in southern Spain, Samuel Rodriguez of Portugal. And Peter Faber and Francis Xavier were his first roommates. And just as a little aside, Francis Xavier later admitted that at first he couldn't stand Ignatius. I guess he felt a little kind of put on the defensive because Peter Xavier was young and a little wild. And later on, of course, they became the closest of friends. And he gave them the spiritual exercises. August 15th, 1534, they decided to take vows at Montmartre. And they did. And they were going to go to the Holy Land together and to labor for the conversion of the Turks. But other things intervened. In 1535, Ignatius's health gave out, and the doctor advised him to go back to his native country. So he left Paris and he went to Spain, and he engaged in spiritual exercises with influential people and conversation. And he returned after his trip home to Venice. And there was another persecution. Rumors and accusations. Cardinal Carafa, who later became Paul IV, and he was put on trial. But the trial was decided in favor of Ignatius. Whenever he was examined, he would answer truthfully, and he was always exonerated. And when he heard the Inquisition was hearing complaints about him, he wouldn't run. He would march into the inquisitor's offices and say, I hear you're looking for me. I hear you have something against me. And it was kind of caught them off guard, but they always had to admit that it could not find anything against him. In 1537, Ignatius and the first companions were ordained in Venice. And so they decided to journey together to Jerusalem to convert the Turks. And at this point, he had another mystical experience. During prayer, he saw Christ on the cross with his shoulder, with his cross on his shoulder, and beside him the eternal Father, who said, I wish you to take this man for your servant. And Jesus took him and said, my will is that you should serve us. And so he looked upon this as confirmation of the path that he had chosen. They were not going to go to Jerusalem, but because of the war, passage to Jerusalem was barred. So they decided to go to Rome and offer themselves to the Pope. As they split up in different groups, Ignatius went with Lainez and Faber. And in 1527, in the suburbs of outside of Rome, as they approached at a little place called La Storta, Ignatius had a vision. And this vision was the confirmation of everything that he had been planning. He said that the Father had, he saw the vision of God the Father and Christ holding the cross. Ignatius stated that the Father had, quote, given him to be henceforward consecrated wholly to his service. And Christ spoke the words, ego tibi Romae propitios ero, I will be favorable to you in Rome. And he didn't know quite what it meant at the time, but he would later, and he would need that consolation because later he would enjoy the favor of the Pope. They reached Rome, and remember, Ignatius had been ordained in 1537. He waited a whole year to celebrate his first Mass. And he celebrated his first Mass on Christmas Day, 1538, in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And it's strange, after his ordination, he received further mystical gifts, the gift of tears, copious tears. He would sob during Mass, and the tears went on to such a point that the doctors warned him that he would go blind if he didn't stop. And so he had to bear down and almost will them away, but they had come to him almost unbidden, completely unbidden. And in Rome, more accusations and difficulties, and he had to give them the others, the companions, the instructions to be very careful about what they said, about giving offense to anyone, be very careful in their dealings with women. And they decided to put themselves at the disposal of the Pope. They preached, they worked in hospitals. Likewise, when they had been in Venice, they all worked in hospitals. And Ignatius and his companions were greeted with suspicion and some persecution at first. The persecution started again. And actually, he said that of all the persecutions they had had, this was the worst. And fake news and misinformation is nothing new. That quite a bit of it was generated against him and his companions. They said they were renegades from a certain country. They said that they had been involved in all kinds of trouble. And Ignatius, true to form, demanded a resolution. And he called the people who had accused him right to the inquisitor's office and had them examined, and the inquisitors reached the conclusion that there were no basis to the charges, and they were just going to kind of dismiss the thing. But Ignatius again pressed the issue. He says, no, I want a trial, I want a resolution. And he did not want, he wanted a sentence to be passed. So they were interviewed by the Pope, and they were cleared and given permission to continue. And their mission was to preach, instruct children, hear confessions, and give the spiritual exercises. We note there the absence of schools and education. We were not originally founded to run schools. It soon evolved into that. But the initial work was to give the spiritual exercises, hear confessions, and preach. And by preaching, I mean sometimes preaching in the street. And the Pope asked two of them, Fathers Diego Lainez and Peter Faber to teach at the Sapienza, the university in Rome. They also, around this time, opened a home for prostitutes, Santa Marta, and to help young women who had fallen into prostitution to reintegrate them into society, to give them dowries so that they could either get married
Excuse me, Scott, 5 minutes.
Yes, okay, thank you.
5 minutes.
Okay. And at this point, they decided to found an order. They needed a rule. So they drafted a rule in 1540. They took it for approval to Paul III. And here we can see a picture of Paul III receiving their request. And Paul III did grant their establishment of the order, and he was elected the first Father General. And at this point, his life changes again. He becomes the administrator. He rarely left the Jesuit curia. He didn't wander all over the place, and he kind of fades into the background in some respects. He wrote over 7,000 letters, and these are not just administrative letters. They advised Jesuits to, and he advised the Jesuits to do the same and edit their letters for clarity and style, because he felt that these were a permanent witness. Many of the letters were to women, and others to Jesuits to encourage them. And he was someone, if he were alive today, he would be online. He would be constantly sending emails. He would be constantly posting on social media. He was a very social person. He wrote letters by the thousands, and we still have many of those. His friendship with women, most notably Isabel Roser, who was a great support, and later became the only woman Jesuit, and didn't last as long as they desired, and eventually she left or was dismissed by Ignatius. It was not a good match. In 1548, he was questioned again by the Inquisition about the spiritual exercises, and again vindicated. A little bit about those spiritual exercises. They're not dictated by Our Lady or an angel, as I've heard some people say, and they're not entirely original, as I mentioned. They draw from the work of the monasteries in the Middle Ages. And what he added was much refining and honing and the addition of his own experiences. So who was Ignatius? He was one who confronted his fears. He refused the easy or the more comfortable. And many times when he was afraid of something, he would force himself to do it. And then he would feel a great sense of release. We saw how he grew up in a culture where honor was greater than life itself and shame was worse than death. And so he had to push back against his own ego and self-interest, his love of honor and glory. And what he did was transfer that to God. The motto of the order, ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God instead of himself or others. And so God became the recipient of all honor and glory. And so this was in a sense, he transformed his own weaknesses into a very positive spirituality. He was consoled by countless mystical visions, as I've mentioned. He was somebody who delighted in looking at the stars and created order. And in 1556, he developed a malarial fever. He died alone one night in his room. They were going to call the doctor in the morning, and he died during the night in his room. The autopsy disclosed that he had serious kidney and bladder stones, which were the cause of his stomach pains all those years. He was beatified in 1609, canonized in 1622. What do we draw from him? The center of his spirituality, finding God in all things. No activity is excluded from Jesuit endeavors. The world is our religious house was the motto. Generosity of heart and spirit. Whatever is good for souls. Wholehearted ministry to the poor and the desperate. And finally, the discernment of spirits. With all of these things, he took who he was, he took his life experiences, he took God's grace, and he transformed it into a spirituality that speaks to everyone, and especially speaks to everyone today. As we look at the times of Ignatius, they're not all that different from our own. We face many of the same challenges, and the being able to find God in all things and to find God in our weakness and to find God in outside the confines of what is normally thought of as religious is very Ignatian indeed. So with that, I will bring our comments on Ignatius to an end, and I will turn this over to Pat, and right on time.
Wonderful, Scott. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. I guess there's hope for all of us. If Ignatius could turn around from his life, we all have a chance. There are quite a few questions. Some of them I think will be explored in greater detail in the next few sessions. The first question is Ignatius's bad spirit his ego?
That's perfectly possible. Yeah, well, when we wouldn't think today that these are literally evil spirits and good spirits. We don't have two little spirits like the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, like in the old cartoons, we continue to call them spirits, but these can be the tendencies within us. So that bad spirit can be his ego, his fear, his fear of discomfort, his fear of dishonor. So very much so. And I'd say today, there's more of a psychological take on the two spirits than there were at his time.
What was the purpose of the penance and asceticism in the life of Ignatius in his own mind?
In his own mind, he was, first of all, he was emulating the saints and the Desert Fathers and so on. That's what was going on in his own mind. The other thing was, and I think here there's a lot of self-loathing and self-punishment too, as he began to feel disgust at his sins and disgust at his life, that he was, in a sense, putting to death those tendencies within himself. So he probably had a lot of mixed understandings of what he was actually doing, but uppermost in his mind, he was imitating the saints.
When were the spiritual exercises written, and what part of Ignatius's life were they written in?
It's interesting. Some of it is unknown. As I said, they drew on that manual from the late Middle Ages, but the earliest published one is mid-16th century, so around 1550, somewhere around there. And there was a lot of annotations on it. There's a lot of modifications. And so it was probably mid-16th century, like the 1550s or whatever, before the exercises in the form that we have them made their first appearance. But it's something that kind of evolved over the years as he would add the different things, like the thing about thinking with the church and things like that. I mean, those were very clearly put in there to satisfy people who thought that what he was doing was somehow subversive.
What was the crime that Ignatius and his brother committed when he was younger?
That's a good question, and that's anybody's guess. I think they found the police record that just said they were arrested for abominable crimes. They didn't say what they were. And it's interesting. We can speculate and so forth, but he was a wild young man, and he carried a sword. It could be anything. And it was during the carnival time, so it was like the big parties that we have in our own times and so forth, where the rules are kind of loosened a little bit.
Good answer. What is the origin of the black habit of the society, and what does Black Pope mean?
The Black Pope just merely refers to the Father General of the Society of Jesus. Because for so long they wore a black cassock and a black beretta on the head, and supposedly had a lot of power that was second only to the Pope. So they used to refer to him as the Black Pope. I don't know, the black many times for the friars in the Middle Ages, usually their habits were brown, and it was made out of sacking and so forth. I'm not sure exactly where the black came in.
Are the exercises too complex for us to understand, even in the simplified version? Is this correct, that they're too difficult for us to understand?
Okay. First of all, the spiritual exercises are not for the people who are taking the exercises. It's about as interesting as reading a telephone book. The spiritual exercises is kind of an outline and a manual for the person who's giving the exercises, not for the one who's taking it. So if you go on a retreat and they hand you a copy of the exercises, that's not good. That's not a good sign. The director should give you what you need at a particular point in a particular time. Secondly, there are versions, modern versions, where they take the old text and put it into modern terms and make it to give people a lot easier access to it. But no one should think that they have to sit down and read those exercises and get anything out of them. There's not much to get out of them just reading them.
Could you explain consolation and desolation?
Consolation is when you have a feeling of great peace and joy and there's no appreciable cause for it. If I win the Lotto Max tomorrow, I'll feel very consoled, but that's not consolation because there's external cause. But if I win absolutely nothing tomorrow and I feel a great sense of joy and peace and exhilaration and so on, and there's no external reason for it, then that's some kind of gift from God. That would be consolation without cause. Desolation, the same thing. Desolation, if something bad happens to me or something, if I get a call and say you're fired or whatever, that there's a good reason to feel desolate. But if everything is going along fine and all of a sudden you feel like you've fallen into a pit and you're depressed and nothing seems nice and you get, you are upset and not at peace and all that, and there's no appreciable reason for it, that's what would be called desolation.
On what grounds was he canonized? Did he perform any miracles?
Good question. I'm not sure of that. And I'm not sure that they applied that in those days, that necessity for miracles. But I'd have to look that up. But the grounds he was canonized on are his great sanctity and the great works that he did in establishing the Society of Jesus and so on. So as for his great zeal and for the apostolate and his great ministry.
What does it take to die to yourself? Can that be done in us?
Could that be done what?
In us.
Oh, to die to self, that's something that can take a lifetime too. I mean, and it's something not just for Christians. I mean, Buddhists do the same thing and all that with the annihilation of the self. To die to self is a spiritual practice that goes on for a long time. And it's when you make constant, deliberate choices to serve others rather than self, and to think of others rather than self, and to kind of not give in to every impulse or desire that you have and so on. So it becomes, to die to self is a lifelong spiritual practice rather than something you can do in a weekend seminar or a self-help book or something. It takes a long time. I'll let you know when I get...
I'll put these two questions together. Why was the woman who became a Jesuit not a good match? And so many of the women orders were attracted to Ignatian spirituality and wanted to follow the path of the Jesuits. Yeah. What was the attraction for women, and why was there a reluctance to accept them?
Well, there are many reasons, reluctance to accept. You know, some of it can be chauvinism and misogynism and so on. With Isabel Rosa, it broke Ignatius's heart to have to dismiss her, but apparently she probably confronted a lot of the misogynism in the order itself, but also she was a noble woman and was quite used to giving orders rather than taking them too. So there was probably fault on both sides there, but she didn't get along, they didn't get along, and eventually he decided for the sake of unity, he would have to let her go. And there's a very long and touching letter that he wrote to her, letting her know that, because she has helped him quite a bit, and he was very grateful to her. And it's a good question. I mean, Other orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, have women's branches and so forth, and we don't. And but in a sense we do, because many, as you say, many of the female orders, the nuns' orders, have Ignatian spirituality and Ignatian constitutions and so on.
We just have time for one or two more questions. Does the book written by Father Michael Hansen, S.J., The First Spiritual Exercises, cover an equivalent for Annotations 19?
I really
Are you familiar with that book?
No, I'm not familiar with the book, so I shouldn't comment on it. Thanks.
Okay. Was Ignatius known for his reading of scripture?
Good question again. When I say reading of scripture, usually for people of that time, they wouldn't carry around a Bible because, they were very expensive and so forth. What they would probably get are bits of scripture in collections. And so sayings of Jesus, sayings of the saints and so forth. So a lot of them probably came from pious books. And so he was not known for reading the Bible, completely through or anything like that, but was well acquainted with what he needed. Well, for instance, when he went to Jerusalem and so on. So he would have been acquainted with some parts of it there.
Was Ignatius influenced by Benedictine rule, and were they contemporaries?
No, Ignatius and Benedict were not contemporaries. Benedict lived in the 6th century, but when he was staying at that monastery, that manual that he was introduced to was written by a Benedictine abbot. And in many of those Benedictine monasteries in the late Middle Ages, they had these manuals of spiritual exercises. The spiritual exercises were ways of prayer and meditation and mortification and so on. So this formed the framework for what developed into his own version of the spiritual exercises later on.
The Latin letters behind you, what do they mean?
Well, actually, they're Greek. And it's we say IHS, but it isn't an H. It's iota and eta and sigma, and those are the first 3 letters of the name of Jesus. And the Latin letters behind me on my virtual. Okay, AMDG. That's ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, and that's the motto of the Society of Jesus.
Can you recommend any books that would help people to learn more about Ignatius?
Oh, wow, I should have come prepared for that one. There's a number of books. John O'Malley, my professor when I was studying theology, has written several books on the Jesuits. And so those would be good books to read. And he's a fine writer and a fine teacher. There are lots of books on Ignatian spirituality out, and you could probably check any website like the website for Jesuits Canada, and they might have different books that would be recommended, and also maybe just to do a Google search or whatever. But there's a number of books out, but I'd say start with John O'Malley's books. They're very good.
And the last question, is there consolation with prior cause?
Well, it would depend. I mean, usually consolation doesn't have a prior cause, and spiritual consolation. Other things can be consoling, to be sure, but spiritual consolation doesn't have a prior cause, this is how you can distinguish it from something else, and likewise with desolation. And so to have that come out of the blue when you're least expecting it, and without any particular cause, is usually, Ignatius would say, that's a sign that it's the good spirit.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our evening. I'd like to thank, on behalf of all of the participants, Scott Lewis, Thank you very much. This has been very informative, and I'm sure it's sparked a curiosity in many of the participants, as it has in me, to read more and learn more about Saint Ignatius of Loyola. So thank you very much, Scott. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Now, keep in mind our next session is next Tuesday night, and I'll turn this over to Jose for some last minute housekeeping.
Not much to add, just a reminder that a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website tomorrow, 24 hours from right now. And it will also be sent to all of you via email. And as Pat said, we'll see you next week in the second session, if you're registered, in the second session of this webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.
Thank you, Scott. Good night.